Welcome to Only for Your Ears, and today's episode 13, The Wicked Prince, which I've renamed as The Wounded Prince That Fought with God and Lost. Let's start off with the structure as usual. The summary, where I will read it and highlight the most important points. Then I will go into a critical review, which I will use sentences from the summary to frame my ideas and how the story pertains to today's society. And then I will talk about the trigger points that I saw running through the story that affected me. So let's begin. The wounded prince that fought with God and lost. Once upon a time, there lived a wicked prince whose heart and mind were set upon conquering all of the countries of the world and on frightening the people. He devastated their countries with fire and sword, and his soldiers trod down the crops in the fields and destroyed the peasants' huts for fire, so that the flames licked the green leaves off the branches, and the fruit hung dried up on the singled black trees. I digress. This prince sounds like a really insecure and frightened boy who is constantly playing defense in order to feel in control. Many a poor mother fled her naked baby in her arms behind the still smoking walls of her cottage, but also there, there the soldiers followed her, and when they found her, she served as a nourishment for their diabolical enjoyments. Demons could not possibly have done worse things than these soldiers. I digress again. Unfortunately, this is a common state of affairs in the military, which has existed through the ages. The prince was of the opinion that all this was right and that it was only the natural course which things ought to take. I digress. Just because he believed that all was right, well, most people would think they were right if they didn't receive any feedback. It doesn't mean he was right. His power increased day by day. His name was feared by all, and fortune favored his deeds. I digress again. This is clearly an abuse of power. He brought enormous wealth home from the conquered towns and gradually accumulated this in his residence riches, which could nowhere be equaled. He erected magnificent palaces, churches, and halls, and all who saw these splendid buildings and great treasures exclaimed admiringly, "What a mighty prince!" But they did not know what endless misery he had brought upon other countries, nor did they hear the sighs and lamentations which rose up from the debris of the destroyed cities. The prince often looked with delight upon his gold and his magnificent edifices and thought, like the crowd, "What a mighty prince! But I must have more, much more. No power on earth must equal mine, far less exceed it." I digress again, people. It's clear to me that the prince's need to quietly gloat over his prized possessions means he would never be satisfied because items and things cannot replace love. He made war with all his neighbors and defeated them. I digress again. He needed to defeat all his neighbors and people inferior to him. To proves he feels powerless, not powerful. The conquered kings were chained up with golden fetters to his chariot when he drove through the streets of the city. These kings had to kneel at, at his and his courtiers' feet when they sat at the table and lived on the morsels which they fed, At last the prince had his own statue erected on the public places and fixed on the royal palaces. Nay, he even wished it to be placed in the churches on the altars, but in the priests but in this the priest opposed him, saying, Prince, you are mighty indeed, but God's power is much greater than yours. We dare not obey your orders. Well, said the prince, then I will conquer God too. I digress. This fool had no idea the invisible real reality of the spirit world could diminish him in a moment, and in his haughtiness and foolish presumption, he ordered a magnificent ship to be constructed with which he could sail through the air. It was gorgeously fitted out, and all and of many colors, like the tail of a peacock. It was covered with thousands of eyes, but each eye was a barrel of a gun. The prince sat in the center of the ship and had only to touch the spring in order to make thousands of bullets fly out in all directions, while the guns were at once loaded again. I digress. The prince has no idea what an invisible spiritual phenomenon he is fighting. With hundreds of eagles, they were attached to his ship, and it rose with swiftness of an arrow upwards towards the sun. The earth was soon left far below, and looked with its mountains and woods like a cornfield where the plough had made furrows which separated green meadows. Soon it looked only like a map with indistinct lines about it, and at least it entirely disappeared in mist and clouds. Higher and higher rose the eagles up into the air. Then God sent one of his numberless angels against the ship. The wicked prince showered thousands of bullets upon him, but they rebounded from his shining wings and fell down like ordinary hailstones. One drop of blood, one single drop, came out of white feathers of the angel's wings and fell upon the ship in which the prince sat, burnt in it, and weighed upon it like thousands of 100 weights, dragging it rapidly down to the earth again. I digress. The prince is out of his league. He is confused at the strength of the angel. There was no blood, no drop of blood. He can't contend with the spiritual realms, which he can't comprehend. The strong wings of the eagles gave way. The wind roared round the prince's head, and the clouds around. Were they formed by smoke rising up from the burnt cities? Took strange shapes like crabs, many miles long, which stretched their claws out after them, and rose up like enormous rocks, from which rolling masses dashed down and became fire-spitting dragons. The prince was lying half dead in his ship when it sank at last with a terrible shock into the branches of a large tree in the wood. My. Determined. I will conquer God, said the prince. I have sworn it. My will must be done. I digress. It's clear the wounded prince needed to experience an ego death. He had no real confidence. It was all fake, ego-driven confidence. And he spent 7 years in the construction of wonderful ships to sail through the air, and had darts cast from the hardest steel to break the walls of heaven with it. I digress. It took several years to build this monstrosity, which would do nothing except embarrass the prince. He gathered warriors from all countries, so many that when they were placed side by side, they covered the space of several miles. They entered the ships, and the prince was approaching his own when God sent a swarm of gnats, like bit like mosquitoes. One swarm of little gnats. They buzzed around the prince and stung his face and hands. Angrily, he threw his sword and brandished it, but he only touched the air and did not hit the gnats. Then he ordered his servants to bring costly coverings and wrap him in them, that the gnats might no longer be able to reach him. The servants carried out his orders, but not one single gnat had placed itself inside one of the coverings, crept into the prince's ear, and stung him. The place burnt like fire, and the poison entered into his blood. Mad with pain, he tore off the coverings and his clothes too, flinging them far away, and danced about before the eyes of his ferocious soldiers, who now mocked him. The mad prince, who wished to make war with God and was overcome by a single gnat, like a mosquito, as I say. I digress. So God humbled this pathetic man to an emotional, psychological, and frightened little boy over something equivalent to a mosquito. So the mighty wounded fool was robbed of his power. Incredible. What an incredible story. Really about an ego driven, wounded man who acted in wicked ways. So let's take a look at my critical review on how this story plays in society today. The wounded prince that fought with God and lost is an incredible story that sheds light on so many situations roaming today's society. Underneath all the bombast, hubris, immense craving for power, lies a frightened boy in need of self-love and an empowered soul. Through this fairy tale, you'll see the prince slowly but surely experience an ego death. It's very painful, which from my own personal journey feels like a caterpillar that turns into mushy jello until it forms into a beautiful butterfly, if only for 3 days before it dies. In other words, that place of naked humility where your flesh feels like an exposed nerve that jumps under the glare of the universe's light of disinfectant. Yes, but anyone that's received an ego death, you will be able to relate to this eye-opening fairy tale. Let's begin with a few sentences which will frame my review. Number one, well, said the prince, then I will conquer God too. I digress. This fool has no idea the invisible reality of the spirit world that could diminish him in a moment. And in his haughtiness and foolish presumption, he ordered the magnificent ship to be constructed with which he could sail through the air. Satan, which I will talk about. Satan knew what he was doing when he disobeyed God and ultimately was thrown out of heaven with other good angels. Jesus himself also confirms the battle appears to have occurred before the creation of Adam and Eve, as Satan is already present in the garden in his fallen state. These facts so far are all that we know for certain. The exact reason of Satan's fall is unknown to us though theologians have presented some possibilities. This reminds me of the expression, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. It is a bit like a frenemy, you know. When you have a close friend who is in competition with you, but you hope the friendship prevails. This friend knows all your trigger points and knows how to hurt you in ways you couldn't imagine. Take, for example, the film The Turning Point, starring Anne Bancroft and Shirley MacLaine. This is an old film, but it is a great, great story. It's about two dancers, two wonderful ballet dancers. One wants to be a ballerina, but she also wants to have a family with the man that she's in love with, who's also in the dance company. But people deem could be homosexual because he's just so good looking. He's really, really handsome. The other dancer is Anne Bancroft, who all she wants to be is a ballet dancer. She doesn't want to have children. She doesn't want to get married necessarily. She'd like to have a partner that tells her that she was wonderful, beautiful, acts like a good soundboard for her. But she really doesn't want the family type situation like her friend does. So what happens is that they're both trying out for the part of Anna Karenina as ballet dancers. And during the rehearsal, Anne Bancroft starts teasing her about her future husband. But back then, he wasn't a future husband, he was just a boyfriend. And she says, a lot of people are chasing your husband or chasing your boyfriend. A lot of them don't know whether he's straight or gay. And this could be a problem. He could be he could be a target. So during the time when they're rehearsing, she solidifies her relationship with her boyfriend and gets pregnant. And that basically ends her opportunity of being chosen to play the lead in Anna Karenina. So Anne Bancroft gets the role the way she wanted it. And Shirley MacLaine marries her husband, her boyfriend, who she's pregnant with, and has 3 children. And over the years, their relationship has been tainted, tarnished, because Shirley MacLaine's character felt that she never really got a fair shot to really try and see if she could be Anna Karenina. She was sort of nudged in the opposite direction by her best friend, who I would call actually a frenemy. She was more in competition with her than she was actually a friend to her. That's why I talk about Satan and God and Jesus and the rest of it. So anyway, one of her oldest children, who's a girl, turns out to be a phenomenal ballet dancer. And she joins the company that Anne Bancroft is still with, well, which her mother was with too. And she goes on to do extremely well. And before she gets to do a solo on stage, Anne Bancroft says, I think she's going to do it for you. I think she's going to be the ballet dancer that you never thought you could be because you got married and had 3 children. And her daughter goes on to become the star. And there's a mixture of feelings. There's a mixture of, oh, I wish I could have been the star. I wish I could have done it. But there's also pride as well. And Anne Bancroft she just simply admits, yes, I pushed you out of the way. I knew that you felt threatened by your husband and by the fact that he could be gay, even though he wasn't. And I pushed you in that direction because you wanted to have children anyway. You wanted to get married anyway, but you wanted to have your cake and eat it too. And so did I, she said. So did I. So I pushed you out of the way. Your good friend or frenemy pushed you out of the way. So in the end, they both got what they wanted. It's just that Shirley MacLaine's character in the film felt cheated. So this is a perfect example, I think, of how, we can compete. We can have a close friend. Satan was very close to God, and God gave him enormous power, but yet he was in competition with him and gravely disobedient. And he thought, sometimes when you are someone's favorite, you feel that you can be disobedient and get away with whatever you want. And he pushed him, and he pushed God too far, and he threw him out of heaven. Let's go on to the second one. Okay, I digress. It's clear to me that the prince needs to quietly gloat over his prized possessions. Means he would never be satisfied because items and things cannot replace love. This reminds me of the ostentatiously rich people who sit and look at their luxury items but are really unhappy. I'm drawn to the film Pretty Woman. Now, everybody knows Pretty Woman was a roaring success with Richard Gere and Julia Roberts. But I find myself thinking about Richard Gere's character in Pretty Woman, where he plays this incredible, powerful businessman that just dismantles companies. He dismantles them, he takes them out of bankruptcy, he sells them off, and he has all this money. But during his time with Julia Roberts' character, who is serving as a sort of a prostitute, and he falls in love with her over about 5 days, she starts to notice there's a change taking place in him. And the first or the second night they go out to dinner and they meet this man. He's a shipping magnate, and his name is Mr. Morris, and his company is in serious trouble. But he's an incredible man. He's an older man. He brings his son along, very ambitious man. But he's a real person. He's down to earth. And Richard Gere's character is not used to that. His name's Edward, I think. His name's Edward in the film. He's not used to that. He's not used to being around real, authentic people, which Julia Roberts' character was. And so is this Mr. Morris. And he comes across as though, I'm going to fight for my company. You're not just going to come in here and buy me out and take me into bankruptcy and destroy my company. You're not going to do that. And Richard Gere's character, Edward, finds him very funny. He says, he's a stubborn old man, kind of just like his father who died, who never really built anything. And towards the end of the film, he changes his mind about Mr. Morris. He really likes him, which Julia Roberts points out straight away. She goes, I think you like Mr. Morris. And he does. And he decides, something? I am tired with not building anything. I don't build anything. All I do is destroy people's companies, just like the prince does. He destroys people's countries and just takes the items, but he's not happy. And at the end of the film, you get to see where Edward, he gets the girl, he's very happy, And finally, he gets a company and decides to build ships, great big ships, because he realized just destroying people and destroying companies and just reaping the profits wasn't enough for him. Number 3, I digress. This prince sounds like a really insecure, frightened boy who is constantly playing defense in order to feel in control. And the two people that come to mind are, for example, Donald Trump, who's in a world of hurt and pain and trouble now, and his sparring partner, who he played with for a long time and who manipulated him a lot, was Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, and in some ways, Donald Trump are very, very similar in a way. Vladimir Putin is a very strong man, I believe, and he's a very bright man, very intelligent man, far more intelligent than what Donald Trump is, with all his bombast. And also, Donald Trump has personality disorder. Whether people want to acknowledge that or not, I believe that he does, considering I came from a family, toxic family, with a mother that was undiagnosed narcissistic personality disorder. But Putin, with all his strength, and he does have power, but he doesn't use his strength or his power effectively in the right way. And it's now beginning to unravel. People are beginning to see there's this warlord that's in his army that is, I think he's in the Russian army or in the Ukraine. One of them, he is just beating Putin. He's just badgering him. He's just pulling him down. He's dismantling him bit by bit. And what's really interesting, it's a bit like what God did in some ways, very similar. It's not even big and explosive. Just it's like a sculptor chipping away at the clay, just chip bit by bit by bit, almost like death by 1,000 cuts. And I believe that this is coming towards the end of Putin. And the reason why it's coming towards the end of Putin, whereas before, all of his other adversaries and people that came up against him, they were really afraid of him. And Putin knew that they were afraid of him. It's like a dog that can smell fear. Putin can smell blood and fear. And he knew that these people were afraid of him. But he also knew that he could win. In this case, with this warlord, he's terrified of him. He's absolutely terrified of him. And I think this warlord has a good chance of really dismantling Putin. And with Donald Trump, he was never really that secure as a person. He was always pathetically insecure. And now it's like the mask of his confidence. It's like the inauthentic mask, the fake mask that he stuck on and tried to look as though he was this confident man, is being pulled apart as well. Society is getting the real picture of who Donald Trump is. And it is a very weak and insecure person. On the other hand, with Putin, he's not really that weak and insecure, but he does not know how to use, I think, his power in an authentic way without having to destroy everybody around him so he can be the most powerful one. It's very, very lonely at the top, and it's even more lonely when you slide down that rocky mountain and you're there by yourself amongst other ghosts that have died too. So let's go on to the trigger points. Let's talk about the trigger points that I saw running through the story. And that triggered me. I will say, honestly, it triggered me. I will conquer God, said the prince. I have sworn it. I will, my will must be done. I digress. It's clear the wounded prince needed to experience an ego death. He had no real confidence. It was all fake. Well, I can relate to the anger the prince expressed when he says, I will conquer God. But I was smart enough to know from my years of being inside the godly and spiritual institution not to threaten God with such words. Even though I felt mad, I am by nature a control freak because I've always felt that what God wants for me isn't what I wanted for me. But I have realized that God's plan requires an opening of the heart. For example, before I came to Vancouver, I really didn't want to help heal people. This sounds horrible, I know, and self-centered, but it's true. And for a strong empath, that's strange. However, in 2021, my undiagnosed narcissistic mother died, and I was quite relieved. I had spent the first 21 years of my life being her narcissistic provider and slave. The rest of my life, I was trapped in emotional residue from a toxic family environment that felt helpless to heal from. It wasn't until the pandemic where I could feel the real subtle movements of change and transformation coming in. It wasn't until after I had been diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer, my cat of 20 years had been put down, had to be put down. I was evicted from my apartment because I didn't receive any resources with the pandemic. My financial resources were depleted. And it was around this time when I decided to become a life coach. I guess through all this pain that I was going through, instead of my heart being closed and taut and angry, I was surprised it's like my heart opened up like a peach on a fresh summer's day. What I noticed about God, he tends to blow up plans that don't include faith or that doesn't include faith. It's important to lean on God. I definitely experienced an awakening. And in this awakening, I think I was about like 22 years in Spain, and my insecurities was at an all-time high. And I just thought I was just going to die from immense insecurity. And what I realized as I started to come into my own through the latter years of the pandemic, I felt a sense of confidence, a sense of faith, but more confidence, a belief in myself that I never experienced before. And I realized what God wanted me to do. He wanted me to have confidence and self-belief, but he did not want me to have fake, phony, bombastic ego and self-confidence the way that, for example, Donald Trump has, and for what, in a way that a lot of people in society have. So he had to he really worked on me. And when, upon reflection, I said, my goodness, I really went through the dogs with him. It felt like it. But in the end, when I say I have stepped into my power as a woman, I really have. So the triggers But this part was, yes, I felt anger. I felt a lot of anger at God. But I knew that any kind of attack towards God would be futile. I would just lose. My arms are too short to box with God. I am fighting with a supernatural spirit realm, and I could not win. So I knew that triggered me when I saw that in the story. But I understand why it triggered me, and I know that I have dealt with the trigger. The second one, trigger, the need to defeat all the neighbors and people inferior to him proves he feels powerless, not powerful. There have been many times in church where I felt like boxing with God, but knew this would be futile. I was dancing in a company called the Gus Solomon's Dance Company. I felt deserted, powerless, as the whole company went against me. The company felt like an invincible, merciless prince with an artistic director saying nothing. I was one of the hardest, if not the hardest, working dancers in that company. I was like the second hardest working dancer in the company. I wasn't the hardest, but I really worked very, very hard. And of course, there was jealousy and anger going on, circulating, a lot of backbiting, a lot of bitching. I mean, it was a really unpleasant environment. And I was left to just really defend for myself because the director just didn't really care that much about me. He was black himself, but he didn't care about me. He was much more interested in the men and also the white dancers because those white dancers for him made him feel important, made him feel superior, whereas I probably made him feel inferior. So he wasn't going to support me, no matter how wrong no matter how badly he saw people treating me in the company. And I wanted to stand up, but I wanted to stand up in a way that was kind of more low vibrational. And there was a situation where one of the dancers who was, I would consider him today and back then, not a very good dancer, great body, good stage presence, but not a good dancer and had no sense of rhythm as a type of dancer that you had to tell him to do everything because he didn't know how to do it himself. And he was very frustrated with me because he was actually jealous. I couldn't believe it really. A male dancer being jealous of this female dancer, I found it kind of strange. But he was. And one day, he just exploded all over me and said, you're so stupid. You're so stupid, 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 stupid. I can't believe how stupid you are. And I thought, my God, Gus, say something. At least I couldn't say anything. I didn't even know. I didn't have the confidence to say anything. But I would have thought the director would have said something, but he didn't. And what was interesting, I felt, well, nobody's on my side anyway. But the next day, something amazing happened. And I'm sorry to say it was amazing, but it was. This dancer came into the rehearsal studio with a huge black eye. I couldn't believe what happened. Well, what happened was after he had the rehearsal with me, he was out on the street at night. Somebody was drunk, kicked their leg in the air, and gave him a huge shiner. And he was furious. And I realized then that the spirit world was on my side, but God wanted to take care of this, not me come in and take care of it. He wanted to do it. He wanted to show that he was on my side. And the last one is, I digress. The prince is out of his league. He is confused at the strength of the angel. He can't contend with the spirit realms, which he can't comprehend. Have you ever said something or done something against a sibling out of jealousy, but feel justified? Well, the story in the Bible is amazing. It's one about Esau and Jacob. Esau and Jacob were two brothers born to Rebecca and Isaac. Esau was very physically athletic and was a man's man. He went out into the woods and he got deer and he brought it home and brought food for the household. Very, very strong physically. And Jacob was cunning, somewhat jealous, but clever, a mentor, mentally very agile. And the mother took to him, and he was her favorite. Jacob was her favorite, and Isaac was the father's favorite. Now, I'm going to say this, it's really important when you have children not to show favoritism, because anytime you show favoritism, it causes jealousy amongst the children. Well, anyway, the father was close to dying, and he decided that Esau should go out and bring back a game, so when he dies, they could have a really big feast. And when he died, he would give his inheritance to Esau. Well, while Esau was out hunting down the game, Rebecca, the mother, helped Jacob disguise himself as Esau. So Jacob could get the blessing and the promises of the inheritance. So as the father was about to die, the father promises Jacob, thinking it's Esau, and he gives him the inheritance. Esau comes in and realizes what's happened, that the father has died and given Esau's inheritance that he promised to Esau to Jacob. And there's a huge fight, argument, and Jacob runs away to Laban with his wife and has his wife and children there, and doesn't speak to Esau for over 20 years. Well, Esau, he decides to come back. Jacob decides to come back and confront Esau. And what happens is he meets with an angel, and that angel is God. And what happens is that he fights with the angel. He fights with the angel. And Jacob is so stubborn and so determined. He said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So he felt that he had the right to be blessed, even though he knew he had done something wrong. He was jealous. He stole something that he shouldn't have stolen. But that didn't mean that he was a bad, wicked human being. And a lot of times when siblings do horrible things to each other, sometimes we feel that we are bad human beings and that nobody would ever forgive us. Well, God was willing to forgive, but what he did, he said, okay, I will bless you. And then he touched his hip and he caused an injury in his hip, and he would have this for the rest of his life. But God did that to him to let him know, yes, I forgive you, but I also want you to know what you did, and what you did was wrong, even though I blessed you. So there I felt triggered again, because it reminded me of, the relationship that I've had with my sister. We've had this really difficult relationship, in some ways a bit like Esau and Jacob, in a sense where my mother especially, and my father too, used my sister like pawns. My father preferred my sister, my mother preferred me, and used us as competition. and we've never really got on that well. But due to understanding and due to developing wisdom and over the years and realizing the triggers and the mistakes that not only children make, but adults make and our parents make, I'm learning to just forgive and let go. So this is the end of today's episode. The wounded prince that fought God and lost. And I'd like to just remind you, please leave a comment, press like, give me a good thumbs up, and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, and you're more than welcome. I'd love you to be part of this community, and so please join in. Give me a like, thumbs up, make a comment, positive as possible, and I will see you next week. And just want to say, healing is a lifelong lesson, gift and blessing we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong lesson and blessing we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Goodbye.